My golden sister slandered me to steal our inheritance. I found proof, and now she's out of the will.
My name is Eric. I'm 26 years old. And let me tell you a bit about my older sister, Katie. She's 29, and growing up, I was always the one left in the background while Katie took center stage. It was as if our family existed solely to showcase her. She was the golden child, the pride of our parents, a flawless little queen in their eyes. Picture her with that shiny blonde hair, cold, calculating eyes that always seemed to say, "I'm better than you," and a smile that had everyone around us enchanted. But to me, that smile always looked like a mask, hiding something dark and corrosive. Beneath the glittering surface was a selfishness so deep that I sometimes wondered if she even saw anyone else as real people. Katie had a knack for making people adore her without lifting a finger. She didn't need to try to be the best. She simply was, by default, in everyone's mind. And I was left in her shadow, where I was constantly reminded to look up to her, to be inspired by her supposed achievements. But what achievements? Katie never did anything on her own. Her real talent lay in manipulating people. She had this almost supernatural ability to bend people to her will, and she did it without shame. It was like she was acting in a never-ending soap opera, pulling the strings while everyone else stumbled around, oblivious. She could slip out of any situation, talk her way out of any mess, and somehow there was always money or some perk in it for her. For example, one time she borrowed a decent sum from my best friend, and when he asked for it back, she claimed she'd already repaid him. My friend never saw a dime of that money, and yet he was left doubting himself, convinced he must have forgotten. Katie had that effect on people. She could convince them to believe anything she said, no matter how absurd. People saw her as almost saintly, as if she floated above the rest of us with an aura of innocence, a halo practically glowing around her head. Meanwhile, her so-called innocence was just a mask, a cover she used to get what she wanted, leaving others to deal with the fallout. It didn't take long for me to see through her, but trying to open anyone else's eyes was useless. No one wanted to hear a word against perfect Katie. She was untouchable in our family's eyes, and challenging that narrative felt like fighting a force of nature. I learned to keep quiet, to watch her antics from a distance, like a spectator at a show I didn't want to see but couldn't look away from. It wasn't that I didn't want a closer relationship with my sister. It's just that every attempt felt like running headfirst into a wall of polished charm and hidden resentment. Then everything changed when Mom fell ill. A serious diagnosis put a dark cloud over the family, and as soon as talk of inheritance began, Katie saw her chance. I could sense it, like the air before a thunderstorm. The family's attention, already skewed in her favor, intensified. Suddenly, everyone seemed to move in a synchronized dance around Katie, whispering and exchanging secretive glances. It was as if Mom's illness had given them all an unspoken mission to protect dear Katie from any stress or responsibility. Even though Mom was the one who was sick, Katie somehow became the center of attention, as if her feelings were the ones that mattered most. I was stunned. Here we were, faced with a real crisis, and yet the family was acting like it was just another act in the ongoing drama starring Katie. The inheritance discussions became hushed and clandestine, and every time I tried to join the conversation, they'd fall silent, their eyes shifting to Katie as if waiting for her approval. I was left on the outside, invisible in my own family, watching them rally around her as though she were some fragile angel in need of constant care. It felt surreal, like I was caught in a twisted fairy tale where the golden princess ruled, and I was cast as the silent bystander. But this time, it was more than just family favoritism. There was something darker in the way they all gravitated toward her, almost like they were conspiring to keep me out. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were hiding something, that there were plans being made that didn't involve me. I knew Katie well enough to suspect that she had a hand in this strange, secretive atmosphere. She'd always known how to manipulate people, but now it felt like she was using her charm to turn our family against me, to make sure I stayed silent and out of the way. Every time I tried to bring up Mom's illness or ask questions about the inheritance, I was met with vague answers and sidelong glances, as if I were intruding on a private conversation. It was like they didn't even see me, or worse, like they saw me as an obstacle. Katie had everyone's attention, and I was just there. The younger brother needed only to stay quiet and accept whatever crumbs of information they felt like giving me. Yet despite all this, I couldn't ignore the tension building inside me. I wasn't just going to sit by and watch as they shut me out of my own family, as Katie played her games with people I cared about. The golden child, the family favorite, the angel with the hidden claws. I'd watched her long enough to know that whatever she had planned, it wouldn't be in my or Mom's best interest. I knew a storm was coming, one that would test everything I thought I knew about family. And this time, I was done staying silent. One night, as I passed the kitchen on my way to bed, I overheard Katie talking to Mom in a low, conspiratorial whisper. I couldn't quite make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Katie was setting the stage for her next melodramatic performance, and this time, it seemed like she had cast me as the villain. The way she was whispering, it was like she thought I was some dark agent from a third-rate detective novel, lurking in the shadows and plotting against her. Mom was nodding along, looking entirely enthralled, and I couldn't help but think, here we go, another episode of Save the Princess. A week went by, then another, and gradually, I started noticing a strange tension whenever I was around Mom. She would look at me like I'd brought something toxic into the house, her gaze sharp and cold, like I was someone she barely recognized. It felt surreal, like I was at a party where I was supposed to be the guest of honor, yet I was the one being avoided. Only this wasn't a party. It was my own family, and I was still the outsider, isolated in a way that was beginning to sting. Finally, after days of this silent treatment, Mom confronted me. She looked at me with an expression that was a mix of disappointment and fear. And then, in the steadiest voice she could muster, she said, "You know, Katie told me you're involved in something bad." The words hit me like a slap. It was so absurd, I almost laughed. It sounded like she was accusing me of murdering her beloved houseplant. Stunned, I asked her what exactly Katie had told her, but I wasn't ready for the list of crimes that followed. According to Katie, I was practically a one-man criminal syndicate. She'd painted a picture of me as a tax-evading, mob-connected delinquent with a side of mysterious dealings. It was like I'd been cast as the lead in some absurd crime thriller, only without my knowledge or consent. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was this really about me? But the saddest part was, Mom believed it. Katie's story, outlandish as it was, made sense to her frail mind, especially since she trusted Katie implicitly. Mom's health was shaky, and with Katie constantly around, feeding her this poison, it was easy for her to fall into the trap. I could see the fear in her eyes every time she looked at me. The rest of the family caught wind of these accusations, and suddenly it was like they all saw me as some ticking time bomb. Without so much as a question or a second thought, I was branded the family's problem child, the example of what not to become. Dinners became tense affairs where everyone watched me out of the corners of their eyes, as though expecting me to suddenly confess to a life of crime. The only one who wasn't buying it was Grandpa. He was old, wise, and, thankfully, not so easily manipulated. When he looked at me, it was with a calm, understanding gaze that seemed to say, "Don't worry, kid. I see the show too." Grandpa didn't mince words. One evening, he pulled me aside and told me plainly, "Katie's just trying to make you look guilty. She's been doing this since you were kids." Hearing him say it was like finally being seen. The day finally came. the day Katie had been building up to like it was the trial of the century. Mom gathered everyone around the dining table, turning our living room into some sort of high court. It was a full house. Grandpa quietly observant as always. Aunt Mary with her perpetual scowl, eyeing me like I was already convicted. And, of course, our precious Katie, seated with a smugness that could fill the room. She looked like she was about to deliver the closing argument in a grand case, as if she held some ultimate truth that would crush me once and for all. I could practically feel the tension crackling in the air. It was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. As soon as we settled in, Katie wasted no time. I swear, she knew exactly how to take command of a room. She thrust her chin out, eyes glinting with the anticipation of the drama she was about to unleash. She'd barely taken a breath before she launched into her performance. She was practically glowing, like she'd rehearsed this moment 100 times. "Mom, I just can't keep quiet any longer," she began, in a voice dripping with feigned concern, casting herself as if she were the lone voice of reason in a world gone mad. I nearly laughed. She made it sound like I was some monster terrorizing the family, and she was the brave soul stepping forward to save everyone. But she didn't stop there. Her words rolled out, each one more absurd than the last, and somehow she said it all with this tone of deep sincerity, like she was reciting a heartfelt prayer. "Eric stole money from me, and has been waiting to get his hands on the inheritance," she declared, the false innocence in her voice making me sick. She layered lie upon lie, her gaze sweeping across the room as if waiting for a standing ovation. It was a twisted performance, and even Grandpa, who'd seen his fair share of drama, choked on his tea. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. As I sat there, stunned, only one thought kept running through my mind. Are you serious? This isn't Hollywood. But Katie kept going, piling on one vile accusation after another. She painted me as some kind of cunning, ungrateful parasite, practically accusing me of plotting to drain Mom dry and sail off into the sunset with her savings. She even threw in some wild claims about catching me snooping around the house, as if I'd been caught red-handed in some secret heist. I could see Aunt Mary glaring at me, her eyes narrowing with each accusation. And Katie? She was absolutely radiant, as if this was the crowning moment of her life. Every word she spat at me felt like a slap. I wasn't just some family member who'd disappointed them. I was a traitor, a leech, the embodiment of betrayal and greed. Her gaze was venomous, a twisted smile pulling at her lips as she recounted each sin I'd supposedly committed. She stared me down, savoring every word, like she was sipping the finest wine, reveling in my ruin. Watching her take pleasure in my humiliation made my skin crawl, but what hurt the most was Mom. She was seated across from me, and as Katie's lies sank in, I could see her resolve weakening. There was a flicker of doubt in her eyes, and at one point, I even saw her blink back tears. It felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I tried to speak up, to defend myself, but Katie anticipated my every move. Each time I opened my mouth, she cut me off, countering my protests with a smug smile as if she had an airtight case. To her, this was the grand finale, her most triumphant moment of public manipulation. She was practically glowing, like she'd just won an award for Best Family Destroyer. And the worst part? The rest of the family seemed to be falling for it. They watched me with suspicion, their faces a mixture of disappointment and disgust, like they were looking at someone they'd once known but no longer trusted. Only Grandpa seemed unaffected, his sharp eyes fixed on Katie with a look that told me he wasn't buying a word of it. But even his quiet support couldn't stop the storm Katie had stirred up. She had everyone else wrapped around her finger, her lies turning my family against me one by one. Watching her bask in her twisted victory, savoring each poisoned glance thrown my way, I felt a surge of anger. She'd orchestrated this entire charade, and here she was, relishing in the sight of my reputation going up in flames. After that disastrous night, I sat in my room trying to process what had just happened. See, I'm not the type to let someone walk all over me for their petty whims. And if Katie thought her sneaky maneuvers would work, she'd clearly underestimated me. I decided it was time to act. This golden girl had been floating in her delusions of infinite power for way too long. First, I turned into a bit of a detective. No hat or magnifying glass, though. These days, social media does wonders. I opened her profile and scrolled through every post. And voila, I found something interesting. She'd recently bought herself a brand new luxury car, shiny as a diamond in the sun. Typical photo with her hugging the hood, captioned, "So happy with my purchase. Always knew I deserved only the best." Honestly, I nearly laughed. But then I thought, where did she even get the money? She only works a few hours a week at a local gallery, nowhere near enough to afford these toys. Something wasn't adding up. And then it hit me. Katie was clearly hiding something. Maybe it was some kind of shady scheme, so I decided to dig deeper. So began my little mission, the lone avenger versus family corruption. I knew I had to see this through, so I reached out to my old friend Tom, a hacking genius and, honestly, a bit crazy, but in a good way. He was immediately on board. "Oh, we're taking down your darling sister? Give me a minute." A couple of hours later, I was holding a real bombshell. I looked at her bank transactions and saw what could have been a plot for a crime movie. Massive transfers routed through strange accounts, ultimately landing with Katie. Money that, as it appeared, had come from Mom's accounts. Just like in the movies. Katie had actually funneled a hefty sum to herself while painting me as the villain in her drama. I could almost hear her sneering, "Oh, Eric's lying again." But now I had the evidence. Not just slips of paper with numbers, but an entire financial trail leading straight to her. I printed everything out, carefully placing it in a folder, eager for the moment her golden child story would come crashing down. I waited, primed like a boxer before a big fight, prepared, furious, and dead certain I was ready to strike back. Now, all I needed was the right moment for this princess to realize her fairy tale was over. And so, the big day came. I waited until everyone was gathered at Mom's again. As usual, the family settled into their spots, tea in hand, wearing their million-dollar expressions. Katie, of course, basked in the center of attention as if she'd just been crowned Saint of the Century. Only this time, I had a real ace up my sleeve. I laid the folder on the table like a final dramatic flourish. All eyes immediately fixed on those papers, and Katie's face went pale, like she was staring into the abyss. She looked at me, and I could see fear and fury in her eyes. Oh, it was sweet. I began explaining what the documents contained and how our dear Katie had transferred money from Mom's accounts while telling everyone I was the most suspicious person alive. And then her act began. Oh, those crocodile tears. "Eric, how could you forge these documents?" she cried, as if it were a Hollywood drama. She sobbed, screamed, called me a fraud. I thought any second now she'd launch into a monologue about how I was destroying her poor heart. And then, bam, Grandpa. That old wolf had been suspicious for a while. He looked at Katie and calmly said, "You know, I saw you with a new ring last week. It certainly didn't look budget-friendly." The family turned to Katie, and her face started to redden. She suddenly seemed trapped by everyone's stares. Grandpa kept going. "Katie, you haven't worked in months, have you? So where'd the money for that come from?" The family finally started to see that their golden girl wasn't so innocent. She muttered something about a gift from a friend, but no one was buying it anymore. Her castle of cards was crumbling, and for the first time, I saw Katie lose her grip. Mom sat there looking as if she'd just been struck by lightning, her eyes wide, her mouth open, a classic look of shock. Silence filled the room. But of course, precious Katie didn't wait long. She flipped out like someone had hit the panic button. Her lips trembled, her eyes darted around like a cornered rat. "You're all just jealous of me! You've been jealous my whole life!" she shouted, as if that justified everything she'd done. Her voice carried a tinge of hysteria, and her perfectly styled hair now looked slightly disheveled, like she'd been caught in a storm. She accused everyone, from Mom to Grandpa, of not loving her, of never valuing her. A family drama fit for Broadway, only without the happy ending. And then Mom, completely serious, declared, "You know what, Katie? I'm not leaving you a cent of the inheritance." Bam! Now that was a twist. And I won't lie, I'd been hoping for it. Katie began yelling, threatening revenge. Would have been funny if it wasn't so sad. But everyone in the room now understood her charade. Grandpa, unruffled as ever, threw in, "Well, Katie, I think no one here is exactly happy to have you around." His calmness only fueled her breakdown, and she began pacing around as if looking for an escape. But all the doors, unfortunately for her, were closing in her face. The family finally came to a decision. Her shiny, polished golden girl mask shattered before everyone's eyes. When Katie finally left, leaving behind shattered trust and a complete family mess, everyone exhaled. Just like that, she was gone, as if she'd never existed. As the door closed behind her, the room was filled with that kind of silence where everyone looks at each other, trying to process what had just happened. All those years, we'd looked at her as a star, the golden child, only to find out that her shine was as thin as the coating on cheap jewelry. Later, Mom came up to me and, looking down, apologized. I could see how hard it was for her. "I'm sorry I so easily believed her words," she said, and it sounded almost like a confession. I think she too felt the pain of realizing she'd spent years in an illusion carefully maintained by Katie. And yes, it wasn't easy to forgive her. After all, I'd spent so much time feeling like an outcast in my own family. But there was a strange peace within me, as if a long storm had finally ended. As for Katie, she was out of our lives for good. Mom firmly said she was out of the will. And you know what's ironic? I wasn't even particularly happy about it. I just realized that no matter how deep someone tries to bury the truth, it always finds a way to the surface. Sometimes through forgotten bank transfers, and sometimes through a full-blown family crisis. So now, I can sleep peacefully. All the false accusations, all the suspicion are finally in the past.